This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you been thinking about therapy? Have you been trying to get in to see a therapist? Have you found that a lot of therapists that you've been recommended to have either closed books or they've got a really long waiting list? Sometimes months. If you're lucky, it's a couple of weeks. Now, what if there was an alternative that gave you quicker access and at your convenience? So when starting to think about looking for a therapist, try BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient and flexible to your schedule needs. So just fill out the brief questionnaire and get matched with a registered therapist. You can also switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So get moving with therapy and visit BetterHelp. BetterHelp.com/Gunter today will give you 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gunter, GUNTER.
Listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host, and let me ask you some questions, and this is particularly directed at men. Okay? So first question, do you feel that you and your partner truly understand each other well? Second question, do you often find yourself in arguments or in conflict that sort of doesn't make a lot of sense to you? It feels like you're talking either over the top of each other or, are completely at odds, or just the whole thing is just really confusing and you get frustrated, and then you either sort of get very defensive, go on the attack, or just withdraw. Okay? Now, I'm not sure if any one of you have ever really taken a deep dive into why this is happening, if it is indeed happening in your relationship. And I dare say that in all relationships, this happens from time to time. None of us are really immune from that whole process. Okay, so I want to make that very clear. And I'm the first one to put my hand up and go, yep, even in my relationship, it doesn't happen very often, but at times, sometimes my partner and I, do get into that conflict, and suddenly the emotions running high, and it feels yucky and awful, and we just need to stop and start again. Well, in today's episode, I'm going to basically begin the focus on the very cornerstones of human interaction. And so you might go, okay, well, what's that? Well, the first one's empathy. Empathy, and this is being bandied about from pillar to post, is the thing that can help transform interpersonal relationships. Now, the reason why this is particularly important for us as men is that the way that we're socialized actually almost forces us to dial down our capacity to empathize, because we're taught to be highly competitive, to rely on prestige and status, as a way of reinforcing our social position. Well, being empathic, or even highly empathic, and understanding the other person's position and experience better, actually makes us think that we're less competitive. It's just a whole nonsense, but anyway, let's stick with that for the moment. So empathy is the process that enhances connection. And especially if we now throw in the second element, which is personal territory. Now, when I define patriarchy, one of the first values is being territorial. Okay. Now, I don't want you to misunderstand this, because in this context, I'm talking about personal territory in a very specific way. When I talk about being territorial, it is essentially being defensive against the intrusion or the invasion of my space. Now, that's true of personal territory as well. Okay, so for example, sexual harassment, right? That is a boundary violation into someone's territory, whether that's male or female. And yes, you know, I don't know exactly what the statistics is if we were to look at it, but I reckon 90 to 95% of sexual harassment actually occurs male to female, where the female is the victim, the male's the perpetrator in that context. But believe me, there are women who sexually harass men. And perhaps, my sort of percentage is off, but the majority of this stuff, it's like violence. The majority of the violence occurs from male to female, where the female is the target and the male the perpetrator. And I know the men's rights movement goes off their face about this stuff all the time, but guys, suck it up, because you're talking through your ass. So the idea here is each one of us in a relationship have a personal territory. Now, the third element in bridging and enhancing our human interaction is through a process of communication. But the question is, what sort of communication? Now, both as a philosopher and as a psychotherapist, one of the things that I have found absolutely vital in my experience of working with people is the idea of Socratic communication. So let's explore how these tools, for want of a better word, can lead to a better alignment and attunement in our intimate relationships. So let me run across a few key points. Okay, so what's the role of empathy in relationships? Now, a lot of you are going to go, well, that's obvious, putting yourself in the other person's shoes so you can understand them more. But it's also the sharing of feelings of one another. And it's more than simply a relational skill. It's actually the glue of human connection. As I've said, for men, we are often socialized. In fact, in most instances, we're socialized to prioritize independence and a sort of wacky stoicism, wherein you don't show your emotions, you internalize them, keep them under lock and key. And so embracing empathy in that field can help us redefine how we interact with one another, especially in the intimate settings. So again, one of the things that I've said in some previous podcasts is that we assume that because we highly individualistic and that we very stoic, we are not affected as much by our partner's behavior. But believe me, in my view, many men are highly sensitive to rejection and abandonment. And it's one of the contributing factors wherein men often feel extraordinarily lonely in relationships. So, the way that I want you to think about empathy is like a bridge. On one side, you have your own emotions and your own experience, and on the other, there are those of your partners. Now, building this bridge requires not just understanding, but feeling what others feel without judgment. Now, I don't want you to think that you've got to get stuck there, because that's not helpful either. Certainly, as a psychotherapist, I need empathy, but I also need to be able to step out of that empathy and really come into a point of differentiation between me and the other person. Otherwise, I'm not helpful. So out of this emerges a deep emotional resonance. And again, one of the things that happens in that, it transforms the relationship. It makes it richer and more fulfilling. Now, not a lot of people talk about personal territory, in my view. They may use other language, but I want to use this very specifically. So, in any relationship, especially in intimate ones, recognizing and respecting personal boundaries are crucial. Unfortunately, especially in the sexual sphere, some men often resort to coercive control to get what they want. Usually not because they're bad blokes, but because they're scared of not getting what they want. So they increase the power rather than negotiating more effectively with their partner. Now, those personal boundaries can be emotional, they can be physical, and sometimes even ideological, right? And I don't want to labor on the ideological at the moment, other than we as men need to understand that when we're behaving badly, we actually are behaving consistent with patriarchal socialization, which is, by definition, a problem. It's bad, right? You can use the word toxic if you want, but it's just bad behavior. And so, the challenge is that a lot of men struggle with this whole concept. And social expectations sometimes dictate a more invasive or assertive stance in relationships. And believe me, one of the things that happens is that women will become traumatized in that response to withdrawal, but also men are traumatized in that. We exist then in a complete state of anxiety in our relationship. So empathy allows us to perceive and respect these territories. It teaches us fundamentally that connection doesn't mean overstepping or consuming another space, but rather understanding where the line is drawn and why it matters to the person we care about. And that is where, the word differentiation is really important. So I need to be able to be differentiated from my partner so that I have a clear understanding about the boundaries and then the process of the next bit, which is transparent Socratic communication. So you might go, oh, well, what the hell is that? Well, this is a method based on Socrates. He was a philosopher in Greece. He questioned everything. It actually got him killed, which often happens in societies that are rather autocratic. And despite that, Greece is described in those days as, the cradle of democracy. There was a level of, authoritarianism in that collectiveness. And in that process, it's a method of questioning, and it involves asking open, reflective questions to better understand the thoughts and feelings of others without judgment, without having preconceptions. So what it does is it requires active listening and then active speaking, respectful speaking. All right. So the process is not about interrogation, right? We're not shining, the spotlight on our partner and running through 50 million questions, but it's about fostering a deeper understanding and a clarity about what the issue, and I use the word deliberately, what the issue is, because quite often in conflict, there are 50 other issues revolving, and we've lost completely the point of why we're in conflict in the first place. Stick to the point. Don't drag in your mother or your mother-in-law or your grandfather or, the last 20 years of misdemeanors. Stay with the point in the moment and stay focused. And if it gets hot, have time out. Take a breather. So this is fundamentally important. So what do I mean by transparent Socratic communication is that we're authentic, that we're honest, and we engage with clarity without aggression or defensiveness. Now, this is where it gets really difficult Because I know from personal experience that there are some words that my partner uses which actually trigger a physical reaction. And it's usually sort of around my midriff, the solar plexus, where I suddenly find myself tightening up. My breathing sort of almost stops for a second. And I go, whoa. Now, once upon a time, I would just put up a wall. Through self-development therapy and being much, much more self-aware and flexible, I've learned to recognizing that that's my problem, not hers. Does that make sense? Really reflect on this. Now, for a lot of men, this sort of communication is fundamentally revolutionary because it goes beyond the binary of someone's got to win the argument, someone's got to be right, and someone's got to be wrong. Right? It also allows for us being able to express our own vulnerability and allows for the exploration of our emotional territory without the fear of being judged or escalating conflict. And if my partner disrespects that, guys, you need to stop and call your partner on it respectfully and say, when you say this, the way that you say it, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what I'm thinking, and what I need from you is whatever it is, okay? Fill in the blank. So I spoke earlier on about achieving alignment and attunement. Now, a lot of you are probably going to go, what the hell's he talking about? Well, so when we exercise empathy and we appreciate and understand personal territory and the whole process of Socratic communication, they converge. And out of that, we become more aligned and more attuned within the relationship. Now, alignment means matching our actions and intentions with those of our partners, while attunement involves adjusting our emotional responses to be more in sync with another person, with my partner, right? So it's like fine tuning, either your amp, if you're playing guitar, or it's fine tuning, your V8 if you're into muscle cars, but it's having the whole thing. And the whole thing is me and my partner, it's I and I, to be running well. It's not spluttering and dying in the bum. All right, we're right in there with one another. We understand each other. Now, occasionally that leads to some funny things. For instance, if you're going out and you suddenly come out from getting dressed and both of you are in the same color scheme without actually having discussed it. Now, some therapists might freak out about that and go, oh, that's a confluent relationship. There are there's no differentiation. That is not necessarily true at all. That is an assumption. Unless I have much, much more evidence of there being boundary problems, I'm not going to jump to that conclusion. And, my wife and I have a bit of a giggle about it, and occasionally she or I might go away and change it up. Or, what's even also more fun in a way, stay exactly the same. So, putting this all together, these elements begin to create a very powerful dynamic. It holds us together. We're individuals, we don't just understand each other, but we begin to resonate with each other more harmoniously. Each person's emotional and personal needs begin to be met and respected. And that's the essence of a deeply connected relationship. Now, I've put this into 20 minutes, basically, but believe me, this can take a decade or so to really practice. And if you're a really quick study, you can get it down in less than 5 because it's out there. You're self-aware. You've been listening to this podcast, so you cannot any longer blame ignorance. Once we have the data the information, the knowledge, we can begin to make wise decisions about how we want to be, and emotionally healthy ones. So the whole point is to create this deeply connected relationship. I was reading some statistic the other day about, how many relationships get past 12 years, and apparently the number is dropping. And in some respects, in a healthy community, I'd like us to be together, in a healthy, harmonious, well-connected, aligned, attuned way for as long as we ultimately live. Because, in my experience, conflict, whether it's emotional, physical, material, is costly. Divorces are costly. Sometimes I work with men who've been, separated and divorced 2-3 times, and they're in, their late 50s, and they're, unless they're super wealthy, that they've taken a massive hit. And so is, in a lot of times, in a lot of instances, their partner. So it's not just, good physical or mental health, but it's also financially healthy to create, healthy, long-lived relationships. Now, I'm not saying we need to stay in one relationship. Some people are happy to open up the relationship and have many partners. That's their call. I'm not here to judge that. But that's not easy either. And, in the future, I'm going to do some podcasts on that sort of topic because I'm seeing more of that. So, as I'm going to close this podcast for today, what is it that I want you to do? I want you to go back to the initial questions, and I want you to sit and reflect on that whole issue of empathy and connection, and how's it look in your relationship? For you guys, I'm speaking to men on this. Can you, with all honesty, say that I understand how my wife feels, and that in that I am deeply connected with her? Because and I get this often from men, and there's this thing about, you can never understand women. That's just bullshit. That's lazy thinking. Get off your butt and get educated and put yourself on the line, open yourself up, be vulnerable, and learn from the experience of that transition from being disconnected to connected, and how much better that feels, how much better you feel. We're often our own worst enemy. We make decisions that alienate us from the person that we love. Now, sometimes we just got to step out. If my partner is, emotionally, psychologically unhealthy and uses, behaviors that are unacceptable, I have a right to draw the line. I have a right to go, this is not in my best interest, and if we stay together, it's actually not in your best interest either. And so I have these issues with your behavior. Will you consider changing those? If the partner says, no, I'm not going to do it, you have every right to step out of that. So I want all of you out there, men and women, to reflect on how these concepts play out in your own relationship. Really consider the power of empathy. And for some people, that's a struggle. They need to really learn it. It's either so defended that they can't quite, get in touch with that. Or there are some people who, unfortunately, for whatever reasons, usually trauma related, who can't do it. They don't have empathy. And then you're either going to therapy or, you could just go into therapy. That's my advice. Consider the power of recognizing personal territory, your own as well as your partner, and the benefits of using that whole transparent Socratic communication. Now, integrate those elements, and when you do, you begin to build stronger, more aligned and attuned relationships. And on that note, I hope this is going to be useful. I really deeply, deeply believe if you put some of these elements into practice, inevitably you're going to have a better relationship with your partner, and also you're going to develop a better relationship with yourself. Self awareness is about exploring my inner territory, my internal world, and with it, the stories that I tell myself, and then maybe tell my partner in an honest way, or I'm telling myself a story that covers up my authentic self, and then I'm trying to convince my partner of that story. Also, not helpful. So, let me thank you for joining me on Inspired Change, another podcast. And remember that, building relational skills isn't just about making our relationships better. It's about making ourselves better. So until next time, stay inspired, keep striving for deeper connections in your life. Be well. This is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.guntersvoboda.com or www.goodmangreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com.